Nathan, I genuinely didn't think you'd show up tonight.
Why wouldn't I?
Because some rooms have a dress code, not just for clothes.
He's never quite understood.
Where to?
You think you deserve this? What is wrong with you?
300 people saw my wife tip my dinner onto the floor that night and heard her tell me where I belonged. What they didn't know, what she didn't know, was that the man she had just humiliated in front of every person whose opinion she valued was the same man whose money had kept her company alive for 3 years running. She had spent 8 years making sure no one in that room took me seriously. It turned out that was the single greatest mistake she ever made, because no one saw what was coming, including her. If you're new here, this channel tells stories about people who stayed quiet, stayed patient, and let the truth do what they never had to. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The night Vivien dumped my dinner on the floor of the Lindenmere Conservatory, every person in that room had already accepted a version of me that she had written for them. I could see it in the way they looked, or rather the way they chose not to. The polite glances that slid past me like I was part of the furniture, the half-smiles that disappeared the moment I tried to hold them. 300 people, and not one of them would have believed the truth about who I was. But then again, I had spent 8 years making sure they wouldn't. My name is Nathan Caldwell. To anyone who asked, and plenty did usually in that careful tone people reserve for those they consider beneath them, I was a technology consultant between projects. That was the phrase Vivien used, between projects. She said it with a small, measured smile that communicated pity without quite committing to it. Her friends accepted the explanation without pressing further, because in their world, a man without a title was barely worth the curiosity. What none of them knew, what Vivien herself had never truly understood, was that 12 years before that evening, I had built something. RootForge was a logistics optimization platform, the kind of infrastructure that doesn't get written about in magazines because it runs beneath the surface of everything. Freight companies, distribution networks, supply chains across a dozen industries, they all ran more efficiently because of what my team built. When the acquisition came, I negotiated the sale, quietly structured the payout through a private trust called Echelon, and stepped away from public life entirely. The founding documents listed me only as NC. The trust held the assets, investments, equities, holdings, totaling slightly over $3 billion, and I had no interest in anyone knowing. Before Vivien and I married, I told her I had a private investment fund and that money would never be a concern. That was true. What I didn't tell her was the full scope of it, and the reason was simpler and more human than she ever gave me credit for. I had watched what happened to people when their wealth became the most interesting thing about them. Friends who stopped saying what they actually thought, partners who stayed not out of love, but out of calculation. I was 40 years old when I met Vivien, and I was tired of being a number. I wanted to be known as a man first. I thought if I could keep that boundary clear, if I could build something real before the money entered the room, then what we had would mean something. For the first few years, I believed it did. Vivien came from the Whitfield family Cincinnati old money with a civic group that had been quietly losing ground for a decade before she took the helm. Whitfield Civic Group Urban Planning and Development carried her family's name and a significant amount of debt that no one discussed openly. When Vivien stepped into the chairmanship, the business was closer to collapse than anyone admitted. I watched her work through it with a fierce, almost desperate energy that I genuinely admired. She was intelligence-driven, and she cared about what the company represented, even when the company itself was failing her. I made a decision without telling her. Through Echelon Trust, using a chain of intermediary entities that kept my name out of every filing, I arranged a credit line of $180 million and purchased a significant block of preferred shares in Whitfield Civic Group. To Vivien, to her board, to the financial press that covered the turnaround, it appeared as though an anonymous investment group had stepped in and believed in the company's future. No one looked too hard. When money arrives at the right moment, people tend to be grateful rather than curious. Whitfield Civic Group stabilized. Then it grew. Within 3 years, Vivien was being profiled in local business publications as the woman who had saved her family's legacy through sheer will and strategic vision. She gave interviews, spoke at conferences, accepted awards. I sat at tables near the back of those rooms and watched her accept the applause, and I felt something I can only describe as a quiet, careful hope. She is happy now, I told myself. Maybe that is enough. It was not enough. The success didn't soften Vivien, it clarified her. She had built an identity around her own competence, and that identity required a certain kind of husband standing beside her. Someone with a title, a track record, visibility. Instead, she had me a man who drove a 12-year-old car, fixed leaking faucets on weekends, and took the occasional consulting project when the work genuinely interested him. She began introducing me as someone between projects with a weariness in her voice that grew more audible over time, as though my lack of visible ambition was something she had learned to endure. In front of her friends, she mentioned that she handled all the household expenses, that Nathan was still finding his footing. She said it with the sympathetic air of someone carrying a burden they had chosen not to complain about, which made it worse than if she had simply been cruel. Her mother, Patricia Whitfield, had never approved of me and never pretended otherwise. Patricia weaponized gentleness the way other people use volume. She never said anything overtly hostile, but every sentence she aimed in my direction carried a small, precise dart embedded in the courtesy. She would ask about my work with a concerned expression, as though she expected disappointing news, and then receive whatever I said with a slow nod that communicated she had expected exactly this. Vivien had grown up watching her mother use that technique and had mastered it herself over the years. It was Patricia who introduced Derek Sutton to Whitfield Civic Group. He came in as director of development, polished, aggressive, in the way that reads as confidence to people who confuse the two, and very skilled at making powerful women feel like the most important person in the room. He was exactly the kind of man Patricia thought her daughter should have married. I noticed how quickly Vivien began referencing him in conversation, how his name appeared in places it hadn't before, how their business trips seemed to extend a day or two beyond what the calendar required. I noticed, and I kept the observation to myself the way I had learned to keep most things. The situation shifted from something I was watching to something I could no longer ignore on a Tuesday evening in October when I received a risk monitoring report from Echelon Trust's financial oversight team. Whitfield Civic Group had requested the release of $24 million for a residential development project called Bellwether Landing. The documentation was thin, no building permits on file, no land purchase records, no contractor agreements that matched the stated scope. The disbursement had already been processed to a consulting firm incorporated 4 months earlier. That firm shared a registered address with a luxury penthouse on the Ohio riverfront. I ran the ownership records that night. The property traced back to an LLC called Sutton Residential Consulting. The following afternoon, I drove to the building on the pretext of reviewing a technology project nearby. I parked across the street. Vivien's car was in the lot. Derek's was beside it. I drove home without going inside. I spent the next 3 days pulling everything I could access through legitimate channels, disbursement records, corporate filings, ownership structures. The picture that emerged was methodical and deliberate. The total, redirected over 3 years across multiple shell companies, was approaching $63 million. Some had gone into real estate and personal accounts. A significant portion appeared to be sitting in a private investment account that Vivien had not disclosed to anyone, including her own tax attorneys. She had been building that reserve for a long time. What I found in the nightstand drawer on a Thursday morning changed the nature of everything. Vivien had a second phone. I found it while looking for a pen, and the screen was already lit with a message from Derek. I stood in the quiet of our bedroom and read the words that told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. He wrote that after the gala, they wouldn't need to pretend anymore that the company, the apartment, and the new life would all belong to them. I took a photograph of the screen and put the phone back exactly where I'd found it. Then I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time and thought about the years I had spent in that room, believing I was protecting something worth protecting. The gala Derek referred to was the Foundry Arts Fund annual event at the Lindenmere Conservatory. Vivien was the honorary patron for the year. According to the thread on her phone, she was planning to use her keynote address to announce a new professional partnership with Derek and to make clear in front of everyone who mattered in Cincinnati that our marriage was over. She believed the prenuptial agreement would ensure she walked away with whatever she wanted. She had signed it 8 years ago, with her own attorney reviewed it alongside counsel, and was confident the document protected her position. What she had never considered was that the agreement had been structured primarily to protect my assets, the trust, the holdings, the equity positions, all of it, predating our marriage and existing outside the scope of what she could claim. I called Claire Donovan the next morning. She was a corporate fraud attorney with a practice in Columbus, someone I had used once before for an unrelated matter, and someone who had no connection to Cincinnati's social world. I brought her the disbursement reports, the ownership records, the photograph of Derek's message, and everything I had compiled in the previous week. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she told me what I already suspected. The fraud exposure was serious. More immediately, several of the transfer authorizations carried what appeared to be my digital signature. Vivien had listed me in internal documents as an independent financial advisor, a role I had never agreed to, never been compensated for, and never performed. The approval records had been generated under that identity from her office on dates when I was verifiably elsewhere. If the investigation became public before we could prove those signatures were fabricated, I would be implicated before I could defend myself. She was not just stealing, she was building an exit that left me standing in the rubble. I had 2 options. I could freeze Echelon Trust's credit line, immediately cut off the capital, and force a reckoning within 48 hours. But doing so would halt payroll, stall active construction contracts, and leave 800 employees inside a company that was suddenly without operating capital while a leadership scandal played out. People who had nothing to do with any of this would pay for what 2 people had done. I was not willing to accept that. The alternative was to wait. Let Vivien believe she was still in control. Let her walk into the gala with her plan intact, her confidence high, and her guard entirely down, and then use that room filled with board members and investors and the journalists Patricia had invited to surface everything at once before a single file could be erased or a single dollar moved. I asked Claire to begin preparing a forensic audit in parallel and told her I needed it ready before the gala. Before I left her office, she asked me if I was certain. She said the moment I revealed my connection to Echelon Trust, the quiet life I had protected for more than a decade would be over. My name would appear in every business column in the state. I thought about the dinner that was coming. I thought about 800 people who had done nothing wrong and were about to lose their livelihoods because of 2 people who had decided the rules didn't apply to them. I told her I was certain. She asked what I hoped would happen. I said she wants the gala to be the last night of my marriage, so let's make it the first night she has to answer for what she's done. The 6 weeks between that conversation in Claire's office and the night of the gala were the strangest of my life. I came home every evening to a woman who was planning to destroy me, sat across from her at dinner, and said nothing. I fixed the bathroom faucet that had been dripping since August. I made coffee in the mornings and left a cup on her side of the counter the way I always had. Vivien barely acknowledged any of it, which was nothing new, but there was a quality to her distraction during those weeks, a focused, finalizing energy that I recognized in retrospect as the calm of someone who believes the hard work is already behind them. She had become careless in ways that told me exactly how confident she felt. She used the desktop computer in the study, our shared study in our shared house, to review documents she should have accessed only from a secured work device. I was not searching through her files, but walls in a house are thin, and a man who has spent years being invisible in his own home learns to hear things he was never meant to hear. I caught fragments, project names, dollar figures, Derek's voice on speakerphone late in the evenings when she thought I was already in bed. Patricia called 3 or 4 times a week during that period, and those conversations were less guarded than they should have been. Vivien's mother was not a bystander in any of this, she was coordinating. She had compiled a list of journalists she wanted present at the gala, specifically the writers who covered society and business for publications whose readership would ensure that whatever narrative Vivien launched that evening would travel quickly through the right circles. Patricia's theory, which I pieced together from the fragments I caught, was straightforward. If everyone in Cincinnati already believed I was an aimless man living off his wife's success, then Vivien's announcement would read as liberation. No one would ask difficult questions about a woman walking away from a husband who had never amounted to anything. It was, I had to admit, a sound plan, and the fact that Patricia had spent 40 years building the social currency required to execute it made it more dangerous than if Vivien had tried it alone. The forensic work ran in parallel the entire time. In the week before Claire's team began their audit, they secured an independent backup of Whitfield Civic Group's complete server, every transaction log, every authorization record, every internal file. That backup was in Claire's possession before Derek learned anything was wrong, which mattered enormously for what came later. Claire's team worked through the structure Vivien and Derek had built carefully because it had been built to resist exactly this kind of examination. They had used multiple separate entities, staggered transactions over 3 years, and calibrated transfer sizes to avoid the thresholds that typically trigger automatic review. The total, when the tracing was complete, was $63 million. Some had gone into the riverfront penthouse and associated accounts in Derek's name. A significant portion, roughly a third, was sitting in a private investment account that Vivien had opened under a name that required careful cross-referencing to connect back to her. The forged signatures were the most serious, immediate problem. Vivien had listed me in certain internal authorization chains as an independent financial advisor, and the digital approvals attributed to me had been generated from her office workstation during business hours on days when I was verifiably in other locations. 2 of the authorizations had been signed according to the server logs while I was in Nashville for a 3-day consulting engagement with its own paper trail. A third had been created on a Tuesday morning when I was at a clinic in Dayton for a scheduled appointment. The documentation to disprove the signatures was clear, but Claire reminded me more than once that clear documentation is not the same as a courtroom verdict, and that what mattered in the first 5 minutes of the gala was not what we could eventually prove, it was what 300 people would choose to believe when they heard 2 contradictory accounts from a woman with a reputation and a man they had always dismissed. The second revelation arrived 3 weeks before the event, and it changed the scale of what I understood myself to be dealing with. Claire called on a Wednesday afternoon with the flat, measured tone she used when she needed me to receive difficult information without reacting to it immediately. She had found a draft formation agreement for a company called Vantage Crest Development, with Vivien and Derek listed as co-founders. The timeline placed the formal launch immediately after the gala. The acquisition strategy involved purchasing the most profitable active projects from Whitfield Civic Group at a fraction of their assessed value, projects developed using the credit facility I had provided through Echelon Trust. Once transferred, Whitfield Civic Group would be left holding the full $180 million liability with none of the revenue to service it. The company I had quietly saved would be hollowed out and abandoned. Vivien and Derek would walk away with the profitable core funded by money they had already stolen, while the remaining structure absorbed the debt and failed. The investors they believed to be a distant institution my trust would absorb the loss. The employees, the vendors, the pension contributions, the community development projects running across the city, all of it would become collateral damage in a plan built to benefit 2 people who had decided the rules existed for other people. 800 employees. That was the number Claire mentioned when she described the workforce at risk. My objective shifted entirely that afternoon. I was no longer simply trying to protect my own assets or end a marriage that had long since become something I didn't recognize. Those concerns were real, but they were personal, and personal concerns are manageable. What Vivien and Derek were planning was structural. Freezing Echelon's credit facility immediately would stop the transfer, but it would also stop payroll and halt active contracts, and the people who had done nothing wrong would feel the consequences before the people who had engineered everything wrong. The gala was the only viable window every board member, every senior investor, and every person with genuine authority over the company's future would be in the same building at the same time. It was the one moment where the information could reach the right people simultaneously before Vivien could shape the sequence of what they heard. I worked with Claire to position people carefully. Margaret Sloan, the longest-serving independent member of the board, received a summary of the financial irregularities through her personal attorney 2 days before the event. She did not yet know the identity of the investor behind Echelon Trust, only that the Trust's oversight team had flagged serious concerns and would be presenting documentation at the gala. Margaret agreed to be present and to hold any action until she had seen the full picture. A representative from Echelon's custodial bank, a senior compliance officer named Thomas Beckett, confirmed as an attendee he carried sealed verification documents and a secure portable authentication terminal that the bank used for high-stakes identity confirmations in field settings. The kind of procedure they maintained for exactly this type of dispute. Ryan Calloway, a financial journalist whose work I respected for its precision and its fairness, received a media credential through the fund's press office. I wanted someone in that room who would get the story right, because I knew that by morning there would be a story whether I controlled it or not. The server backup Claire's team had secured weeks earlier proved its value sooner than I expected. 4 days before the gala, someone on Derek's team flagged an unusual external data access request and reported it to him directly. Derek was more technically aware than his role suggested, and within 24 hours of the flag, he deleted a significant volume of internal correspondence emails, internal memos, authorization confirmations. What he did not know was that none of what he deleted existed only on the company's live servers. Every file he erased had already been copied to storage that Claire controlled, captured in full, before he ever knew to look for the request. His deletions, it turned out, became evidence of their own, a time-stamped record of what he had chosen to destroy and when. Within hours of the deletion, Vivien filed a formal complaint with the company's legal office. The complaint named me, Nathan Caldwell, listed in their system as an independent financial advisor, and alleged unauthorized access to proprietary company data, fabrication of financial records, and an ongoing attempt to extract money from Whitfield Civic Group through a fraudulent advisory role. Attached to the complaint was a packet of documentation, transfer authorizations carrying my digital signature, a summary of transactions presented in a sequence designed to make me appear as the architect of the fraud rather than its target, and a written statement from Vivien describing what she characterized as an escalating pattern of financial manipulation on my part. This had not been improvised. The complaint had been prepared in advance and filed the moment she detected the first signal that something was moving against her. When I arrived at the Lindenmere Conservatory that evening, 2 members of the security staff tracked my movement from the entrance. I noticed because I was looking for it. Vivien had arranged for me to be seated at a table near the far wall, as far from the stage as the room allowed, placed at the edge of the visible space in a way that communicated without a word being said that I did not quite belong there. I found my seat, I accepted a glass of water. I watched Vivien move through the room with Derek at her side, the two of them operating with the ease of people who believe the difficult part is already behind them. Margaret Sloan found me at my table early in the evening before the formal program began. We spoke for several minutes about a rezoning proposal, a project on the city's north side. Nothing that would have drawn attention from the outside, but I saw Vivien register the conversation from across the room. I watched the calculation move through her expression. She had not expected Margaret to seek me out, and that small deviation from her script was enough to change her timeline. She crossed the room with a precision that drew exactly the right amount of attention, not fast enough to seem reactive, not slow enough to lose momentum. Several board members were within earshot when she reached my table. She asked in a pleasant voice whether I had paid for my seat or whether I had let the fund absorb the cost of my attendance. I told her I had received an invitation. She smiled, the performance of a woman entirely in control of the room, and then she reached across the table and picked up my dinner plate. The marble floor was very cold. I remember the sound more than the sight of it, and the way the room registered the impact before the laughter started. A few people laughed immediately, others were still processing. Vivien told the room that her husband was being investigated for unauthorized access to company systems and financial fraud, and that the evening's program would continue momentarily. Derek stepped forward and placed the fabricated document packet in front of Margaret, my name, my supposed signature, the transactions reordered to tell a story that was the precise inverse of the truth. Margaret looked at the documents, and then she looked at me, and her expression was not hostile, but it was measuring the face of someone holding judgment until she understood something she did not yet understand. 2 security staff moved toward my table from different directions. Claire said very quietly that we could leave. Counter-complaint in the morning litigation, the full record presented in court. I had that option. She wanted me to know it was real. I looked at the food on the floor. I thought about 800 people who would arrive at work on Monday without knowing what had been decided in this room tonight. I thought about Derek's hands moving across a keyboard, deleting everything he wanted gone. I thought about how much Vivien had taken from me, and how much more she was prepared to take from people who had never done a thing to her. I looked up at the security staff waiting for me to stand and walk out quietly. I said, "Before you escort me out, I think someone should ask my wife to explain why her company is running on my money." The room did not go quiet all at once. It happened in a wave, starting at the tables nearest mine and moving outward until the ambient sound of 300 people simply stopped, and the only noise left was the low hum of the building's ventilation, and somewhere near the back, someone still laughing before they realized no one else was. Vivien recovered quickly, she always did, and in 8 years of marriage I had watched her redirect a room in less time than most people needed to finish a thought. She looked at the security staff, then at me, and then she addressed the room with the patient precision of someone managing a scene that had briefly gotten away from them. She said her husband had a habit of making dramatic statements when he felt cornered, that nothing he had said carried the meaning it appeared to carry, and that the evening's program would continue in just a moment. The performance was very good. About half the room visibly relaxed. Then I asked Thomas Beckett to step forward. He moved through the crowd with the careful efficiency of a man accustomed to documents rather than dinner parties. He carried a sealed verification packet and a portable authentication terminal, the kind of secure field equipment Echelon's custodial bank maintained specifically for high-stakes identity disputes that couldn't wait for a conference room. When Claire connected her laptop to the room's presentation system, what appeared on the screen above the stage was not a charity summary or a speech slide. It was a trust structure diagram, entities holding companies' intermediary layers, and at the center of all of it, a single beneficial owner, Nathan Caldwell. Claire walked the room through it without editorializing. She let the documents do what accurate documents do, speak in the dry, irrefutable language of institutional finance. The credit facility of $180 million, the preferred share position representing the largest single block of equity in Whitfield Civic Group, the authorization chain that followed to its end, arrived at my signature on the original Echelon Trust formation documents from 12 years ago. The initials NC, which appeared throughout the Root Forge founding paperwork and the Trust's investment records, belonged to the man who had just been asked to leave the room for not paying for his dinner. Vivien said my name in a voice I had not heard from her before. Not the voice she used when performing competence for an audience, and not the dismissive tone she had refined over years of small cruelties. This was something rawer, something that sounded almost like a question, as though the name itself had become unfamiliar to her in the space of 30 seconds. She told the room the documents were fabricated, that I was retaliating against her because of the formal complaint she had filed, and that everything Claire was presenting was a forgery constructed for exactly this moment. She said it with enough force that several people near her visibly wavered. The fabrication theory wasn't unreasonable on its face. People with resources do manufacture documentation, and Vivien had spent enough years building credibility in that room that her word still carried weight. Thomas Beckett then confirmed my identity through the bank's authentication terminal, producing a time-stamped verification certificate that his institution would stand behind in any court. The certificate appeared on Claire's screen beside the trust diagram. At the same moment, Margaret received a notification on her phone from the board's own legal counsel, who had been reviewing the documentation in a private room upstairs at Claire's prior arrangement. The notification confirmed that Echelon Trust had activated an emergency protective clause under the terms of its investment agreement with Whitfield Civic Group, citing material evidence of fraud by company leadership. Every transfer authorization held by Vivien and Derek was suspended as of that moment. The room understood before the announcement finished. I could see it move through the crowd, not shock exactly, but the particular stillness of people recalibrating, adjusting their understanding of a situation they believed they had already fully mapped. Claire moved to the second part of the presentation. The forensic data from the independent server backup secured weeks before Derek deleted anything showed with log-level precision that the digital signatures attributed to me on the fraudulent transfer authorizations had been generated from a workstation registered to Vivien's office on dates when I was verifiably elsewhere. 2 authorizations had been signed according to the server logs while I was in Nashville for a consulting engagement with a full paper trail. A third was created on a Tuesday morning when I was at a clinic in Dayton for a scheduled appointment. Both locations had records. The server logs had timestamps that matched neither my location nor any device registered to me. And Derek's deletion of company files, time-stamped 4 days before the gala, was itself in the record, a documented attempt to destroy evidence by someone who had realized too late that the copy he didn't know about already existed. The security footage from Whitfield Civic Group's offices showed Derek using Vivien's authentication credentials to approve invoices from the shell companies, access he had no standing to have, authorization he had no right to give, credentials that had been handed to him by someone with full administrative control over the system. The final document Claire presented was the Vantage Crest Development Formation Agreement. She did not need to explain its implications at length. The board members in the room were sophisticated enough to read the acquisition strategy for themselves, the plan to strip the profitable assets at deflated prices, move them into the new entity, and leave Whitfield Civic Group holding $180 million in debt with nothing to service it against. 2 board members read it twice. One leaned over and said something quietly to the person beside him. The expression on his face was not one I needed to interpret. Vivien looked at the screen. Then she looked at Derek. And in that look, I saw something shift between them. Not the look of 2 people standing together against a shared threat, but the specific, rapid calculation of 2 people beginning to assess whether their interests still align. Derek's assessment was quick. He left the main room within 20 minutes of the presentation concluding. He was on the phone with his attorney before he reached the lobby. By the following morning, he had begun providing Vivien's legal team with emails, message records, and 2 recorded phone calls in exchange for cooperation agreements that reduced his own exposure. He told them that Vivien had been the primary architect of the plan and had promised him co-ownership of the new company after the divorce was finalized. Ryan Calloway, who had been in the room for the entire presentation, confirmed the cooperation agreement through 2 independent sources and included it in the piece he published 4 days later, a thorough, precise account that gave the facts the space they deserved without embellishment. It was the article that made the story national rather than local, and it was accurate in every detail I was able to verify. The relationship Vivien had sacrificed her marriage for did not end in a courtroom. It ended in a hotel lobby at 11 o'clock at night when the man she had believed was her future made a calculation and moved toward the outcome that served him best. She had trusted him with everything. He responded by providing the documentation that made her case indefensible. Margaret called an emergency board session in the private meeting room on the building's second floor before the gala's formal program had even concluded. The vote to suspend Vivien and Derek from all executive functions pending forensic audit was not contested. There was no one left in the room willing to contest it. When Claire informed Vivien, as the session adjourned, that the riverfront penthouse, the private investment account, and the assets held across the shell companies had all been placed under a preservation order pending litigation. Something in her expression finally gave way. Not grief, not anger, something that occupied the space between them, where a person goes when the architecture of the life they built turns out to have rested entirely on someone else's foundation. The audit took 4 months. The confirmed total was $63 million in fraudulently transferred funds. Derek's cooperation reduced his exposure significantly. Vivien's attorneys explored the same path, but by the time they raised it, there was very little left to offer that Derek had not already provided.
Patricia Whitfield was not indicted.
Her participation had been advisory rather than operational, and the messages that surfaced during discovery, showing she had known about the affair, the penthouse, the plan to publicly humiliate me at the gala, and had actively helped design the sequence of events, did not rise to a criminal threshold. But they were part of the public court record, and the people who had attended her dinners and charity committees and civic board meetings read every word. No one sent a letter, no one made a formal announcement. The invitations became less frequent, then stopped, and Patricia understood exactly why, because the social architecture she had spent 40 years building operated on the same currency she had helped her daughter weaponize against me. She had used her standing in those circles to orchestrate someone else's humiliation. What she lost was the standing itself. The divorce proceeding was briefer than Vivien expected. She entered it believing she could argue that I had concealed material assets and that a skilled attorney could find leverage in that claim. The prenuptial agreement was unambiguous. The assets held in Echelon Trust predated our marriage, had been disclosed in general terms before we signed, and existed outside the scope of marital property under any applicable reading of Ohio law. Her attorney recognized this quickly. The funds redirected through the shell companies were unavailable as marital assets because they had never legally been hers, and a significant portion was already frozen pending restitution proceedings. The house sold. My portion went into a fund to address the employee pension gap that had developed while company resources were being diverted. Vivien's portion was held in escrow against the civil judgment. I did not speak to the press beyond what the legal process required. I did not attend the hearings where her sentencing was discussed. The company survived, restructured its leadership, rebuilt around a management team that Margaret oversaw with the same careful attention she brought to everything. The credit facility was renegotiated, the active projects across Cincinnati continued, 800 people kept their jobs, the pension fund was made whole. I found an apartment on the west side of the city with high ceilings and a view I liked in the mornings, and I let the calendar turn. A year after the gala, an advocacy organization that worked with people who had experienced economic control and asset manipulation within marriages asked me to speak at their annual event. The venue was the Lindenmere Conservatory. I accepted. I arrived early and walked through the room before it filled. The table near the far wall where the marble floor had been cold, where the laughter had come, quickly where the security staff had waited for me to stand and leave quietly, was set now for a different kind of evening. I stood near it for a moment and let myself remember what the room had looked like from where I had been sitting. A man at the wrong table in a space that had decided he did not belong, receiving that verdict from every direction at once. I thought about how completely the people in that room had accepted the story they had been given, and how little any of them had questioned it, because why would they? The story was consistent, the teller was credible, and the subject had never contradicted it. On the stage, I did not talk about Root Forge. I did not talk about $3 billion, or the trust structure, or the documents that had appeared on the screen above the room where everything had come apart. I talked about what it feels like to be made invisible, not the kind of invisible you choose, which can be a form of freedom, but the kind imposed on you by someone who needs you to be smaller than you are in order to feel as large as they want to be. I talked about the people I had met through the organization, people with none of my resources, who had lived inside the same architecture of control, the same quiet erosion of self, without any of the instruments that had allowed me to respond to it. Their stories deserved more of the room's attention than mine. I was grateful to be in a position to direct some of that attention toward them. I ended by saying that the night my wife poured my dinner onto the floor, she believed she was making a statement about my value. What she was actually doing was making a final, definitive statement about her own character and about what she believed she was entitled to do to someone she had decided didn't matter. Walking out of the building afterward, my phone showed a message from Vivien. I had not heard from her in several months. The message said that she would never have done what she did if she had known who I really was. I read it once. I thought about the 8 years before that night, the small erasures, the careful diminishments, the years of being managed rather than loved. I thought about the fact that she still did not understand what she had actually done wrong. She thought the error had been in the target she selected. She had not yet understood that the targeting itself, the belief that some people can be treated as less than human because of how they appear, was the only thing she ever truly needed to answer for. I deleted the message, put my phone in my pocket, and walked to my car in the quiet of the parking lot. That was the end of it. If this story stayed with you, it's because somewhere in it you recognized something true about patience, about silence, about what it costs to be underestimated by someone who should have known better. The people who treat others as disposable rarely see the moment coming when those same people stop absorbing the damage and start letting the truth speak for itself. Stories like this one exist on this channel every week. Subscribe and we'll keep telling them.